And welcome to the Center of Addiction and Faith and our monthly webinar. Our topic today is Invitation to Change, an approach that is a groundbreaking way to address substance misuse. It is grounded in compassion, connection, and the belief that a person can do something to help their loved ones. And so we're going to hear a lot about that today from Reverend Jan Brown. She's an Episcopalian priest, founder and executive director of FaithWorks. She will be a featured keynote speaker at our upcoming conference in October. Just a reminder, our early bird special ends this Saturday. So if you're planning to come either in person or virtually, this is the week to sign up. So go ahead and get that done. So all of you coming from across the country, there was huge interest. We had more than 250 people registered for this webinar. We'd love to know where you're from. Maybe you could click on the chat button down below. Just say your name and what city you're calling in or joining us from this morning. It's fun to see where everybody's from. My name is Pastor Ed Treat. I'm the founder and director of the Center of Addiction and Faith, and we are working hard to awaken faith communities to address addiction. We believe faith communities are very well positioned across the country, but terribly uneducated and unprepared to address the many problems associated with addiction. As we emerge from this COVID pandemic, we're finding addiction and mental health issues worse than ever. So it's an enormous health crisis, and it's calling for our attention, and I think faith communities could do a lot if they were to step up. So we're working toward that. We're glad you're a part of that. Thank you for being here. Let's begin with a moment of silence to think about those who suffer from this issue, and we'll follow that with a serenity prayer, the full form of it. And I'll pray that as you pray along silently. God, grant us the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, the courage to change the things we can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardships as the pathway to peace, taking, as he did, this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that he will make all things right if I surrender to his will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with him forever in the next. Amen. Our webinar today is hosted by Tim McMahon King. He's the author of Addiction Nation, CEO of Vagabond Consulting, and board member of the Center of Addiction and Faith. And he is also the next keynote speaker at the Addiction and Faith Conference. So what we have here this morning is our starting lineup for this October's event. So pretty exciting to have you both here. Tim is also an expecting father. His firstborn is due sometime in September. So Tim, we're hoping you'll bring the baby to the conference and pass it around to the whole group. So thanks for hosting our important.
We're canceling my talk and we're just going to do a slideshow of the first 2 weeks of Ruth Maureen's life.
Sounds good. But thanks for hosting, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Ed, and thank you all for being here. And we do hope that you'll consider coming to this upcoming conference in October. And understand there's a lot of things up in the air at the moment with the Delta variant and COVID. So rest assured, we are watching that carefully and are going to be taking all the best medical guidance at the time into consideration as we're moving forward with that. But we're still hopeful that that is something that we will be able to have both an in-person and a virtual gathering. And so if you are uncertain and you do want to take advantage of saving some money, you can register for the Early Bird Digital. And if you realize later you wanted to upgrade, as long as there's still space, that is something that you can do. And wanted to also give a note on these webinars. So this was something that I had just gotten engaged with the Center of Addiction and Faith, and Ed was making the move from having it be a conference that he helped run as he was also a full-time pastor to something that he was going to be focusing on full-time. And when the pandemic first hit, we started to email because we knew as soon as the lockdowns came that everything regarding addiction in our country was just about to get worse. And sadly, we just got the numbers for 2020. We know that there was an almost 30% increases in overdoses, and that was 93,000 lives lost. And for those of you who work in this space, you know that that's the first wave of consequences that we're seeing, and that's not all of it. As other people who might be using IV drugs, that end can come very quickly. There's a lot of other people out there with struggling with alcohol, and that is a much slower process often. And we know that there's a lot of years of lives that are lost because of these worsening consequences of addiction. And we also see that anything from that isolation that can be so harmful, people losing support systems, harder to access treatment, but then also the reality of disrupted and diluted and poisoned drug supplies. That as soon as one batch of fentanyl gets stopped one place, that doesn't mean that people stop using illicit fentanyl. That means that they're often using something that's more likely to be cut with other drugs or of an unknown potency. And that all of these things have factored into making this addiction and overdose crisis in our country much worse. And so if anyone is interested, you can go back to see the first webinar we did was specifically addressing some of the factors that were going to make addiction worse as we moved into the pandemic. And so as we've gone through these webinars, we've been doing them for a little bit over a year now, we've tried to look at a variety of approaches and methodologies, as well as historical factors that contribute to what we see today. And one of the encouraging things I think about today's webinar, having Reverend Jan Brown with us, is the approach that she's presenting on us today. And from my perspective, what I have seen is one of the most comprehensive community-based approaches that really does a fantastic job pulling from the best of a lot of different ways to understand addiction and all of the complex factors that go into it, and looking at how that is addressed, not just seeing individuals and a pathology, but seeing the systems that are at work and all of the different ways that we as communities can support people, not just in addressing when someone has chaotic or problematic substance use issues, but looking at downstream, how is that addressed much earlier? Because we do need to, as we are doing this work at the Center of Addiction and Faith, trying to highlight what happens when we do need to use the old analogy, help pull bodies out of the river, but also asking those questions of why are so many people ending up in these dangerous rapids in the first place? And so Reverend Jan Brown, I'm excited, a fellow Episcopalian. We've got a lot of Lutheran representation. I'm excited to have more Episcopalians a part of this growing community as well, and is also a person in long-term recovery. So this is something that she is coming at from a deep wealth of professional knowledge and experience, and also her own personal experience and story. And we are excited to have her talk about this approach, the invitation to change. So I'm going to hand this over to Reverend Jan Brown now.
Thank you very much, both Ed and Tim. I'm really glad to be here with you. It's afternoon where I'm located in Williamsburg, Virginia, and I know that we have folks from all over the country. So I'm excited to be here and really pleased to introduce those of you to the Invitation to Change approach and talk a little bit about the strategy and certainly the science behind it. And one of the big pieces about the approach is that it uses both science and kindness to be able to support and facilitate change for people who are struggling with substance use disorder, and truly any invitation to change for any behavior that somebody may be looking to change. So I thought I would start off by sharing one of my favorite videos, and we will get started on the other side of that.
it's just, there's all this pressure, you know? And sometimes it feels like it's right up on me and I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head, and it's relentless. And I don't know if it's gonna stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me the most, is that I don't know if it's ever gonna stop.
Yeah. Well, you do have a nail in your head.
It is not about the nail.
Are you sure? Because, I mean, I'll bet if we got that out of there...
Stop trying to fix it.
No, I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just pointing out that maybe the nail is causing...
You always do this. You always try to fix things when what I really need is for you to just listen.
No, see, I don't think that is what you need. I think what you need is to get the nail
See,
out.
you're not even listening now.
Okay, fine. I will listen. Fine.
It's just, sometimes it's like, there's this achy, I don't know what it is. And I'm not sleeping very well at all. And all my sweaters are snagged. I mean, all of them.
Yeah, that sounds really hard.
It is. Thank you. Ow!
Oh, come on. Ow. If you would just...
Don't...
Try to see things my way. Do I have to keep on talking till I...
Thank you, Tim. And while that is seemingly a very glaring and extreme video, those of you who have worked with individuals or family members, or yourself may be an individual or family member, we all have seen glaring things that we believe need to be fixed or changed, and haven't always used kindness, and certainly haven't always been following the science in order to be able to help support that change. So this invitation to change approach uses both science and kindness to help another person change. And we have partnered with, through SpiritWorks Foundation and our SpiritWorks Institute for Recovery and Resilience, we have partnered with the Center for Motivation and Change, which is out of New York City. And their mission is to get effective and accessible evidence-based tools for change to families and loved ones of those who are struggling with substance use. Also to provide a sense of community. One of the things that we know, especially when working with family members, is that they are often very isolated, and that the emphasis is typically placed on the individual who's struggling and not necessarily the family who is walking alongside those individuals. Also being able to change the conversation about substance use from one that's based in shame and isolation to one that comes from a place of compassion and engagement. And then I think the biggest piece is being able to encourage hope and compassion, certainly for the individual, but as well as helping those who are supporting those individuals be able to develop some self-compassion also. Go ahead, Tim. And so we at SpiritWorks have been able to look at what they call their playbook, and what they have done for us is to develop that and then allow us to kind of redesign it, if you will, for the different communities that we serve in. So right now, SpiritWorks has a group that's running that is parents. And these parents have a safe place and some opportunities to share some things that are specific to them. There are also groups that kind of teach, if you will, this strategy to partners, so to other loved ones, not just parents. There are professional groups, and the hope as well is to begin to get clergy trained so that we can also be steeped in the invitation to change approach and then be able to pass that on or offer it to others. Go ahead, Tim. And so what we have done, again, is to be able to take that model and extend it beyond the primary individuals, family members, community to include churches and parishes, etc. The actual model itself, some of you may be familiar with community reinforcement and family training, which is also called CRAFT. motivational interviewing, and acceptance and commitment therapy. And so each of those are pillars, if you will, of what the model is actually based on. For those of you who are familiar with CRAFT, it really allows family, friends to have strategies for themselves to be able to feel better by changing the way that they interact with their loved one. So this idea of we hear words like codependence or ultimatums or those kinds of things. CRAFT allows family members to move away from dealing in those ways. And then with motivational interviewing, it's a style of communication that follows good listening. So in the very short video clip that you saw, what we want to do is to be able to listen first, this idea of connecting before we correct. And so being able to know the difference of what it is that we're being able to engage in. And then my favorite, I have to say, piece of the model, which I believe is different and has been not included for who knows what reason. So is the acceptance and commitment therapy, which allows someone to align with their values and principles. And so we're no longer pushing them or fighting them. We don't have to feel bad or guilty for them. The change emerges from their own thoughts and feelings and values and traditions as to why they would make the change for themselves in the first place. Go ahead, Tim. And so just a quick picture of the whole model, and then we're gonna go through it. They consider this to be a wheel. The first piece of the wheel is around understanding. So helping to gain understanding that behaviors make sense, one size doesn't fit all, and ambivalence is normal. And again, we'll deepen a little bit of discussion around that. And then there's three pieces around awareness, so that we can develop, once we have some of that understanding, self-compassion, willingness, and self-awareness. And then we move into action. And there are some different tools, both behavior and communication tools and strategies that are offered as part of this model. And everything comes together around practice. So often we learn different strategies and tools, and we don't utilize them, and part of that's because we haven't practiced them. So one of the fundamental pieces of the whole model, if you will, is being able to practice. And so we actually run pure practice groups based on the different aspects or pieces within. And we come together once a month and we've got scenarios and we just go through those, giving people the opportunity to really understand. And so that when you're engaged with your family member or your loved one, it's not the first time that you would attempt to use some of the tools. Go ahead, Tim. And you can skip. So understanding is that first piece. So the three components, if you will, are the first one is that behaviors make sense. And so recognizing that if using substance was like touching a hot stove, then people would have stopped already. And so what we want to be able to do is take the time to understand the other person's perspective. Being able to walk in their shoes is one of the foundational pieces to be able to start helping. Because people are using substances, behaviors, because it makes sense. And so things like, to feel better, to do better, to fit in, those are all things that any and all of us want to be able to do. And knowing that the substance is allowing this person to do those things begins to give us a different perspective. It helps us to know that these are not bad people, that they are simply trying to get a need met. And so the way that they are going about getting that need met makes sense to them. Next slide. The next piece is called one size doesn't fit all, and just the recognition that every person is different, and so are those that we love. And people use substances, they start using for a particular reason, and they stop using for a particular reason. And so what we want to know is, what is that person's reason, so that we can tailor the approach and the resources that we would then be able to offer that person based on the reason that they're using substances. Sometimes where this gets difficult is in either that some of us don't know what the different resources are, or where we live and work doesn't have some of those resources. And so being able to find organizations like recovery community organizations, having resource lists are where churches really can be helpful, in hosting different kinds of meetings. Many of us are familiar with 12-step meetings, and therefore we open our spaces for those types of meetings. There are also many other evidence-based strategies that can be helpful. It really begins with first recognizing that one size doesn't fit all. Next slide, please. This is, I think, one of the most difficult pieces for family members and others to wrap our hands around. And it's the recognition that ambivalence is normal. And so what that means is that change takes time, and that it's not linear, that it's full, often longer than we would like, with back and forth. So reasons for change and then reasons for not changing. And what's difficult about this is that with the drug supply, as Tim was mentioning earlier, we don't want people to have ambivalence because we're afraid that through their use, it could take their lives. And so being able to really recognize that it's not a sign of failure, that it is absolutely healthy and normal. And so for many people, this is where harm reduction would come in, right? So knowing that ambivalence is normal, making sure that people have clean needles, making sure that if they're using opioids, that there's Narcan available, being able to have fentanyl test strips. So during this period of ambivalence, people may continue to use while they are making and trying to find a reason that's strong enough for them to change. Again, this is, I think, one of the scariest pieces, especially given the drug supply that's out there, and our fear that our loved ones or people that we're serving are going to die. Go ahead, Tim. So then we move on to the section on awareness, and that begins with self-awareness. And so one of the things that we know is that our part of helping someone else change starts with self-awareness. And so what we want to do is to become aware of what it is that we are experiencing, and then be able to take care of ourselves and be able to stay connected to what matters most to us. What we often see is that people who are in caring professionals and people who love someone with substance use disorder or addiction, we stop paying attention to ourselves. We do things that are against our values. We are so afraid that something's going to happen to our loved one, that we stop noticing, if you will, and taking care of ourselves. And so one of the pieces that's very important to this invitation to change process is around self-kindness, and knowing what I can do for myself every week that would be kind. And it's not something that needs to be extravagant. For me, often it's, at the end of the day, I make sure that I go for a walk, that's something that's kind that I can do for myself. Or, right now it's watching the Olympics, that I can take some time and do that, so that I can also have self-compassion in the process for my own self. And it will allow a person to stay connected to their loved ones and to themselves if they have the willingness to practice self-awareness and to have self-kindness strategies. Go ahead, next slide. The other piece is the recognition around willingness, and we talk about it as two sides of a coin. And again, what's difficult is that pain is part of connecting to what's important, and it doesn't go away. So while we are watching someone struggle and do things that we would rather they not do, it's going to cause us pain. And so what we are invited to do is to choose to accept whatever it is that's happening and inviting that in as we keep working towards what we really care about. And so, you know, it's going to be difficult when we are walking alongside or loving someone who is using a substance or engaged in a behavior that is risky or dangerous. I'm not going to always like what someone is doing, and I don't need to make that go away for them. That again is me being self-aware. What we talk about sometimes is this idea of pushing the pause button. And it might mean that I need to disengage and take care of myself so that I can allow my loved one to experience their own ambivalence. Doesn't mean that I'm no longer loving that person. It means that I am working towards maintaining my ability to be present and be in relationship with that person. Next slide, please. And then that final piece of this particular section on awareness is the recognition that we too deserve compassion and love. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not about pampering or something that's extravagant. It doesn't make us forget our troubles, because the reality is that they are still there. It's really acknowledging our own experience and then approaching that with kindness. So recognizing that sometimes we're going to say the wrong thing. Sometimes we're going to be tired and unable to be helpful. And so can I have compassion for myself as I'm gaining understanding and compassion for the person that I love? Next slide, please. So then the final section is on action. And so some of these communication tools, if you will. One we called helping red lights turn into green lights. And what we want to focus on in this particular section is that words matter. What we say matters, and how we deliver them matters even more. And so again, if we want to start with listening, and when we do so, we can better understand and we can better respond. Because ultimately what we want is a collaborative approach to being able to help somebody, because that will actually increase our chances of offering them suggestions or strategies that they will be willing to hear. And so kind of in short form, we call this catching the person doing the right thing. What we want to reinforce is the positive behaviors that someone is engaging in. One of the classic examples that I use to help people really understand what this looks like is when parents tell their high school children that, you know, if you go to this party and you end up drinking, no matter what, I want you to call me and I will come and get you. And it's the last thing that we may want to do, but what it does is it increases trust. It allows one's loved one to know that that is not the time for correction. It's not the time for yelling, screaming. It's not a teachable moment. It is simply, we made the agreement that if something happens, that I will come and get you no matter what. And so that's one of the examples. I have pets, which is another example that I use. And sometimes I will call one of my wonderful Labrador retrievers and they will decide not to come. And so, you know, then I may call them again. And so that difficult piece, and finally they decide to come. And so I'm supposed to praise them, which I do, for their willingness to come, even though they've needed to be called more than once. And so once again, what we want to do is reinforce, because ultimately what I'm asking in my case, my animal to do is to come, and they did. In the case of one's child who has gone to the party, yes, I would prefer that that person not be drunk. However they are, and they followed through and called me like I asked them to. And so what is mine allows me to have a different response than I might have had otherwise. Go ahead, next slide. So not only do words matter, right? So this behavior and positive reinforcement also matters. What we reinforce, we get more of. And so really being able to practice that piece of self-awareness, knowing, gosh, when someone tells me a lie or when they don't do what they say they're going to do, I feel that in my chest. And so I just need to know that and recognize that. And then as I am able to be able to respond with intention, to know what I am going to do, and be able to offer them different alternatives rather than punishing, and or this idea of detaching, because both of those types of actions are actually and promote truly negative behavior rather than the behaviors that we really want to see. And so again, being able to catch them being good by watching what they're doing, but also being able to catch them being good and then responding with our words and our tone in that regard matters as well. Go ahead, next slide. And once again, this piece of practice is how we change behavior, not only for someone else, it's how we change our own behavior. And so what we want to be able to do is to create a space that promotes learning and promotes a willingness for people to try new things. And recognizing that as we try new things, we don't get it right often the first time, and that sometimes it will take a long time, even if we are a natural at something, it still is going to take time. And recognizing as well that substances are powerful reinforcers, and that's why people continue to use them. And so being mindful of that, being mindful that no one is going to get something right off the bat, makes us be able to have some compassion for the other person's ability to learn and practice. And it also ought to, over time, allow us to have some compassion for our own ability to learn and practice. And I've got a fun activity that I'm going to invite us to do, and then kind of talk about on the other side. Tim, if you would go to the next slide, I think it's really the concluding slide. So what I would like folks to do, wherever you are, and if you have something to write with and something to write on, what I would like you to do is to take your non-dominant hand and write the following sentence 3 times. I am an amazing human being. So you're writing that with your non-dominant hand 3 times. And I'm sure that you're about finished with that second time. So go ahead and take the time you need so that you can get that done. And I also imagine that it's getting better each and every time that you're writing it. So something to feel good about as you are using your non-dominant hand to write that sentence 3 times. So go ahead and finish up, because I would imagine that everyone is done. And Tim, if you would like to open it up so that we can have time for questions and responses.
Thank you so much, Jan, for that. That was a lot of information, all in just a few slides, and grateful for you and your work and sharing some of your story. And I imagine right now, in particular, one of the things that I keep hearing from folks, and just as a reminder for everybody who's listening in, I'll ask the first question to get us going. There is a Q&A box down at the bottom. So if you have a question, go ahead and jump in there. One of those things that just sounds so hard, especially if it's a friend or a loved one or someone that's close to you, is figuring out that balance of what love looks like and what kindness looks like in the midst of someone struggling with a substance use disorder. And it had been previously, like a lot of, this is a little bit of a broad strokes, but it had seen previously like the alternatives where you were either in an enabling codependent relationship that was bad, or it was the opposite end of the spectrum of cut that person off entirely, or send, a kid to a military boot camp, and, kind of this almost mean aggressiveness. And you're talking about something very different. And I was wondering if you could unpack a little bit of strategies or tactics that you tell other people to use in the midst of that kind of tension.
Sure. So part of the difficulty for people is that we experience it because we do love or care for someone. And so by inviting them to simply detach or to stop doing something or to do something in a completely different way is really not realistic, right? And so recognizing again that one size doesn't fit all for your loved one, also recognizing that one size doesn't fit all for you. Right. And so some family members may make the decision of, I cannot live with drugs being used in my home. And so I need to ask you to leave, is very different than what we hear of, I kicked my child out. Because there are some individuals and families who are willing and able to do that. And so on the other side, there are families who, find different ways to approach that and say, if you're going to use in my house, I'm going to ask you to make sure you have Narcan, to let me know that you are using. And so there's a whole range of different things that people can do. And the other piece is also knowing, again, that piece of the wheel, if you will, knowing that it's okay, right? To have that self-awareness, which says, this is not something that I'm willing or able to deal with. And so again, it comes from us as the responder or those who are attempting to facilitate the change or support the change, and not from the individual themselves. By creating new environments that would therefore be conducive to change, the person then becomes willing to make the change.
I know one thing that I appreciated that's in your presentation, and I was hoping you could talk about a little bit more, because I realized in my own story of recovery how important it was is the behaviors make sense. Because I grew up, with the Nancy Reagan "just say no." And I remember still, it was a Muppet Babies cartoon special about drug use. And these are emblazoned in my mind. And what I remember was drugs are stupid, that they don't make sense. So I was hoping you could unpack a little bit more when you talk about behaviors make sense, why that's important, and why that's sometimes counterintuitive for how we've been raised to think about drug use and substance use.
Certainly. So one of the things that we do is an exercise which we'll kind of go through conceptually, is to allow somebody to listen to the following and kind of say for yourself whether this would be something that you would either want or need in your life. And so to feel less anxious or less worried, to not feel depressed, to feel good or happy, to feel engaged and not bored, to not suffer with physical pain, to feel excited or inspired, to have friends, to feel part of something, to be able to unwind after a brutal week, to be able to focus or concentrate on things that are important to you, to lose weight, to be seen as funny, to appreciate others, to have a satisfying sex life, to get a reasonable amount of sleep, or to feel capable of taking on the challenges of a new day. And so as you consider those questions, again, just kind of self-reflection, would you have been able to say yes to them or to any of them? And I know for myself, I am able to check off a lot of those. And I would imagine that others do as well. And I would also imagine that as we're looking at those things, that we would also say that it makes sense to want to feel that way or to have those experiences. And so I would also think that we would say that none of them are particularly questionable or immoral or unworthy of having as a goal. And so imagine if there was an easy way to achieve those items, would you be interested in engaging in those behaviors? And so that's where, the understanding really comes into play, because for many people, substances allow people to have these different experiences.
I just was talking to a father whose son, after using very high concentration THC products, was struggling in school, and they were going on a camping trip. And he was hoping that it would take his son away from using cannabis products for a little while. And instead, his son brought even more with him. And it was the first time they had the conversation, though, was that his son was petrified that he couldn't relate to his dad if he didn't have them.
Mm-hmm.
And when they were able to have that concentration, it was halfway through the camping trip, the son threw out the rest of what he had brought with him when they had identified that his desire wasn't just this flippant, I just want to get high. It was, Dad, I don't know if we're connected anymore.
That's right. And so using that as the example, what's underneath that behavior is a desire for connection. And who among us would say that we don't have a desire for connection? Very normal, very healthy, not immoral, not questionable to have a desire to connect.
And we've got a few different questions and comments in here. First, it seems like most people weren't able to complete this exercise.
Good. And so the hope being, so once again, writing with one's non-dominant hand isn't like asking someone to give up the drug, which is such a powerful reinforcer, right? And so we're simply asking someone to write a sentence 3 times, and yet sometimes we expect perfection from our loved ones who we are asking to make a change. I get to add a little bit of pressure as people are doing that, and certainly folks feel free to write in the chat what that experience was like for you. I mean, people get frustrated, they get angry, some quit. And so all of those things are reasons and experiences that your loved ones have when they're trying to make the change of giving up something that is such a powerful reinforcer for them.
And right now, I mean, huge example in one of the greatest gymnasts to ever live, Simone Biles, standing up and saying, this is not healthy for me.
That's right.
And a huge step in bravery to be that self-aware. I can't imagine having been that self-aware at all at that age, let alone in the public eye like that.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got a few questions here about family dynamics. So, in particular, how do you, having conversations inside of a family unit, if you've got a loved one struggling with a substance use disorder, where the family doesn't agree. And then there's another question in here about balancing, especially when there's questions of what's biblical, and that some families of faith can be strict and legalistic in their interpretations of that. I was wondering if you could talk more to that point.
Absolutely. So I'll start with the second question, which is one of the reasons I absolutely love this approach, is that it's an invitation to change, or could be, for any behavior. And so it is not only focused on substance use. And so when we're able to kind of become more familiar with it, practice it, at SpiritWorks where I work, it's become part of our culture. And so someone will engage in a behavior that I don't like, and I might not respond in the best way. And one of my colleagues will say, Jan, that behavior makes sense. And it's like, oh yeah, right. And it doesn't have anything to do with someone's use of substances or not. So for me and for others, being able to, what we say, go bigger than looking simply at a substance has been wonderful, to being able to remove oneself from the conversation around legalism or morality or any of those things. Because again, as we look at that list of questions that I invited people to consider, all of those behaviors, or the majority of them, I would think, all of us could agree upon are reasonable behaviors and reasonable things to want.
Yeah. I know a lot of different moral philosophical traditions, there's always a distinction between, does the person desire a bad thing, or do they desire a good thing and are using tools to get it that might have negative consequences?
That's right. So it's more about the strategy, and then wanting to offer someone different strategies to get that need, if you will, met, that need or want, which is what you were describing earlier. The young man wanted connection with his father, and the strategy that he was using was to smoke marijuana, which my guess would allow him to relax, feel less anxiety, and that in his thinking that greater connection could happen. But once that conversation was held, the recognition that there are other strategies that can be used in addition to or aside from smoking marijuana that would allow that connection to be had.
So having here too from Deborah, talking about the problem of stigma and addressing stigma, and then kind of a follow-up from Wilhelmina, still that challenging to figure out that difference between acceptance and kindness. So being worried that if you allowed use, even under conditions inside the home, that is too much of a reinforcement of the behavior. And how she phrased it, or is it that I cannot extend kindness unless I am in a place of acceptance? So kind of two-part question there for you.
Sure. And the first one, I think around stigma is a very good question. One of the things that we get to learn is that there are different types of stigma. And so as we learn that there's, internal stigma, public stigma, and so we want to be able to address the particular kind of stigma in a way that's appropriate for that. And we don't usually do that, right? So most of us don't know that there are different kinds of stigma. And so we try a one-size-fitting-all approach, and it doesn't work. And so, and one of the examples when you were talking about there's 93,000 people who died of a drug overdose, which does not even include alcohol. People cannot see themselves in that way. So there's a tremendous amount of public stigma around substance use disorder. and addiction and overdose and using drugs in general. And so how we need to address that is very different from a public approach than it would be from an individual approach. When somebody's loved one is struggling, individually, one-on-one, we behave very different, right? So the parents who come to our family group love their children. The stigma that they are experiencing is often beyond the walls of the community in which they experience life, because we love them and we know that their children are ill, and we give them a safe place to be able to talk about it. And so they have no stigma, they have no shame. When their children die or are living and struggling, we equip them with language and understanding and self-awareness, and they practice so that when they encounter people, they know what they're gonna say. It doesn't mean that sometimes it doesn't sting or it doesn't hurt, but they no longer have to live in shame and secrecy and isolation. I hope that answered the person's question.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful. And with those like different kinds of stigma, we also know that, especially for teenagers and young adults, when there is a cultural expectation of things like binge drinking, that really can move the bar in a way that you have a lot more young people participating in unhealthy binge drinking behaviors otherwise. And I just caught up with a friend from high school, and I remember I was a little bit younger than other folks in this friend group. And I remember the really cool guy in that friend group who was the life of the party just found out that he's currently in the hospital because he tried to go sober for a few days and had been so dependent on alcohol that he started going into seizures. Mm-hmm. And that was, he's in his early 40s, and he was a cool guy when I was a high schooler. How do you help create a healthy culture without creating unhealthy stigma?
So if I'm understanding correctly, what sometimes happens is kind of parallel universes where, people feel compelled to make a choice of not fitting in because of the behaviors that others are engaged in. So a lot of really neat things are happening these days. And some of it is knowing these different resources and being able to seek them out. One kind of on the top of my head, because it came up yesterday, is there's a big concert that some of our young folks in recovery want to go to. And so we said, look for the people with the purple bracelets, because it means that they are not using. Look for, or before you go to the concert, see if there's a family zone or if there's a recovery space for people who are in recovery who want to watch the concert, or that family space where no drugs are allowed. So a lot of these things they're finding ways for people to be able to participate. The other one, which I know I had a long time to really come to believe, is that everyone doesn't use or engage in negative behaviors or self-destructive behaviors. For many of us who are engaged in those kinds of behaviors, we naturally seek out others who are doing what we're doing. And so the large majority of people in the world are not engaging in harmful or damaging behavior. And I think that's one of the things that, those of us who live in this space or work in this space, we sometimes forget that. If 1 in 10 is struggling with substances, that means 9 in 10 are not. And so once again, being able to kind of get underneath some of those things, so that we can really learn what's going on. And again, that would be the conversation, if you will, around some of that public stigma, that everybody's doing this, when indeed very few people truly are doing this.
Excellent. Thank you. And I see Ed is popping up here, which means we're coming up towards the end of our time. But one other thing that was in here to make sure that we wanted to let everybody know is that Jan has graciously offered to send around. We will have a PDF version of her PowerPoint presentation. So that will go out to everybody who registered. We'll send that out in an email afterwards, along with, we'll also have a recording of this webinar available. And Ed just dropped in the chat there, you'll see a webinar, another meeting link afterwards. So we will be able to continue this discussion immediately following in a more intimate meeting setting for those who are interested. And so
Thanks,
thank
Tim.
you again to Jan, and I'll let Ed make some announcements.
Thanks, Tim. And yeah, that post webinar conversation has turned out to be one of my favorite parts of doing these webinars. Those conversations are the energy, the enthusiasm, and the wisdom and the sharing that goes on there. So I encourage you to grab that link. If you don't grab it here, you won't be able to get in because there's no other way to get it. So copy and paste that link to your browser so that you can get into the next Zoom meeting following this one for the discussion. But thank you, Jan. I especially love the video that you opened with, the nail in the forehead. That really did convey both sides of the challenge of this problem, I thought, so beautifully. The frustration of trying to point it out to someone who's got the nail in their head. And having been the person with the nail in the head, I totally relate to saying, but it's not that. I know you think it's that, but it's not that. And I remember feeling absolutely convinced that that was true, that it really wasn't that. That wasn't the problem. I needed it to be something else. And and it wasn't like I knew that was the problem. I really didn't think it was. And I would get so angry at people, my parents, my brother, for constantly pointing it out. And that's what happens is we're able to shut those people down so they quit saying anything because our reaction is so hostile that they just say, well, I won't point it out anymore. But I've had years now to learn that pointing it out is the most important thing we can do. Is just keep saying, you got a nail in your forehead. That's powerful. That's an intervention right there. Anyway, couple of announcements. We have our webinar coming up. Conference coming up. I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. The next webinar like this will happen either at the end of August or sometime early in September. We're still nailing down the details. We'll be doing something either on the war on drugs or harm reduction. So be watching your emails and announcements for that. It will be good. I guarantee you, as good as this one was today. Our conference is coming up. Both Tim and Jan will be keynote speakers at our next Addiction and Faith conference, but there's lots of other speakers as well. And we have breakout sessions that are tremendous. You wouldn't believe there's so many choices, you'll be angry that you can't get to all of them. Collaborative faith community model, changing the story, codependence, decoding the family system dynamics of addiction, how churches can seek healing and justice, ending the war on drugs, grief relief for those who've lost loved ones to addiction, transformational leaders for addiction ministry. Anyway, that's about a third of the list. Gaming addiction, the challenges of the Native American community, creating a ministry-ready church, core competencies for addiction pastoral care, lots of great stuff. So if you're coming to the conference, you'll be able to take all of this back and apply it into that's the whole design of the conference, is to give you tools and inspiration to do ministry in your own setting. So that's coming up in October. You can come in person or virtually. Early bird prices for both of those ways to attend are available until midnight this Saturday. So you need to get right on that and sign up. I'll be putting a list of links at the end of my announcements here that will take you to all kinds of things that you'll like a link to Jan's website and the work that she does, a link for Tim's book and how you can get Addiction Nation. A great way to prepare for the conference, but also a great tool for preparing your congregation to understanding the problem of addiction and how they can help. So, and then I want to point out our downloadable app. It's really the best thing. I spent a year writing the website, but the website is big and it's vast and it's hard to find all the resources that are tucked in and through it. And so what I did was developed an app that allows you to get to all those resources quickly and easily. It's free. It's chock full of resources. Go to your app store and download Center of Addiction and Faith. Look for a Center of Addiction and Faith and download it. You'll get every webinar we've done on there. You can watch it anytime you want. This one will be posted there as well. There is a podcast there that's, you would not believe the stories. These are stories of clergy who have gone through addiction. Jan, I'm going to want to do your story. I hope you'll allow me to interview you as well. But these backstories on these clergy are just amazing, that what they've gone through, and you really hear God at work in the lives of people that find recovery, and you see the power of God at work in people's lives as they go through hell. It's really inspirational. Anyway, those are free. They're on the app. There's a ton more on that app. I got to tell you, that app is something I'm very proud of. You need to go look at it, download it, and use it. It's meant to be a resource for people who care about people. And then finally, I'll just say this work is done by a number of people. There's so much we want to do, but it does take resources. I'm going to drop a link in there for a donation page. If this webinar and the work that we're doing is of value to you, we'd appreciate any kind of donation. That is most appreciated. But thank you all for being here, for listening. God bless you, and I hope to see you in the following Zoom discussion. I'll drop those links in.